Welcome to the podcast, Whiskey and a Map. Stories of adventure and expeditions as told by those who live them. I'm your host, Michael Reinhardt. It has been said that many adventures and expeditions start simply with a map and a glass of whiskey. A desire to go and see the world's wild places. You're invited to pull up a chair, pour yourself a glass of your favorite whiskey, and join us as we hear stories from another one of our friends just returned from the field. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Wayne Sawchuk. Wayne grew up in the wilderness areas of Canada's Saskatchewan province. He has spent his life exploring this pristine wilderness area of northern Canada. In this episode, Wayne shares stories from these trips into areas rarely visited by man. On one particular trip, Wayne found himself trapped in a mountain pass by a snowstorm with little food and running out of provisions. Escape came in the form of a trail left by a herd of caribou. This is a transformative event in his life. Thereafter, he became an advocate for the wilderness, helping plan and create the Muskwa-Kachika Management Area, protecting 6.5 million hectares of pristine wilderness. Wayne, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad that you're able to join us.
Thank you, Michael.
Wayne, you live up in the Canadian wilderness. What was it like growing up in British Columbia?
Well, in British Columbia in the 50s, when I grew up, it was a pretty wild country then. We grew up on the Alaska or the Hart Highway, which is almost to the Alaska Highway. And at that time, it was pretty much wilderness. There was no roads up any of the side valleys, and it was just basically the Hart Highway running through the Pine River Valley, and that was it. And so during my lifetime, it's kind of proceeded from there to roads up almost every single valley in this part of the country, and I'm talking about the Peace River country in northern British Columbia. So when we grew up, there was grizzlies on the hillsides, and elk and moose used to travel our fields every day, and that kind of thing. Bears, wolves. It was wild country for sure. And so I did get a grounding in real wilderness and just growing up, just being there, in appreciating the country, I guess, or living in the country.
You're best known for your wilderness expeditions. Did you start out as a wilderness guide or explorer, or what did you do before?
Well, I was always interested in the wilderness, and we had horses, and I was always interested in hiking and canoeing and exploring the country. But no, at that point, our family was a logging family. So my dad was a faller, and we owned a logging company jointly as, later on when I got to be in my 20s. Yeah, so that was the basic bottom line. I also did quite a bit of guiding at that point, hunting guiding for mostly grizzly and moose in this country up here. So yeah, it's all associated with the wilderness, but to a large part, what we did at that point was exploit. We were using the wilderness for taking what we needed from it, essentially, whether it was wildlife or timber or whatever it was. And that was what we did when I was growing up. That was our family's job.
Now, when you guide now into the wilderness, you go by pack horses. My understanding, though, growing up, you didn't always have a full appreciation of the horse.
No, I certainly didn't. No, because, those horses, all they ever did was, you put the hay in one end and it comes out the other end, and you have to pack the hay to them, and then you have to pack it away from them when they're finished with it. So no, I thought they were pretty much worthless things until I started going out in the mountains and, packing my cast iron frying pan in my rucksack, and half sacks of Coke, bottles of Coke, and that kind of thing, Coca-Cola. Yeah. So when I started going out in the mountains and actually doing the hiking, I found it was a lot easier. Why not use some of these useless horses that we have here? And so that's basically what we started to do, and never look back. Once we started using the horses, which they're not useless at all, are they? They're our partners and our companions, and they work hard for us and also enjoy their lives. So great. It's been a great experience being associated with the animals, with the horses for so long.
And you've been doing that for over 30 years now.
Yeah, over 30 years. We Well, we started going up in the mountains really in the 70s, kind of in the mid 70s, and then never looked back. We just started taking longer and longer trips. In 1983 was our 45-day trip into the Spatsizi country, which is over to the west from us. That was with a bunch of my buddies from my bar buddies, my drinking buddies. 45 days is a long time out there in the wilderness. Of course, you run out of things out there, booze for one. And when that happened, things got a little ragged on that trip. And so the next year, my girlfriend Carol Ann and I decided, no, we're not going to go with anybody else. Just the two of us are going to do a trip. And so we started out. We launched on an 85-day pack trip out of on the head of the Prophet River and the Musquat into that country, which is the first time into the what would become eventually the Muskwa-Kachika. At that time, just more wilderness. The Northern Rockies in British Columbia is what it was.
I want to talk a lot about that trip, but before we get there, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First, do you have a good drinking story for us?
Good drinking story. Well, yeah, I actually have two, Michael. The first one was the head of the Prophet River, and that was on the trip in 1984. And at that point, of course, it's a long ways to fly in there, and you have to make sure you're very efficient. And so as a result, we packed overproof rum, which is, I don't know what it is, 70% or something. And I remember that first drink out of that bottle because it had been several weeks since we'd had any liquor at all. And we were coming back to one of our spots where we had a cache at an airstrip. My uncle Norman had flown in and brought us a bunch of supplies, including this bottle of overproof rum. And I still remember that first drink. Oh, that was sweet. Beautiful thing. But then the brakes were off because I hadn't had it for so long. I ended up in a very deplorable state on the bank of the Sekonka River at about 2 a.m. And I don't remember the rest of the evening. And I stopped drinking for at least a month after that, which was remarkable at the time. So that was one drinking story that I thought about. And the second one was on the trip a little bit later, about in the early 90s. We were doing a trip up the Muskwa River, and we had to cross the Muskwa River. Now, you have to understand at that point, the Muskwa River is, it's a fairly big river, a deep valley. The valley was fully timbered. It had been burnt over. And at that point, we were trying to find a route from basically the south side of the Muskwa across to the north side, where we knew that the Bedeau Trail had run, because we had traveled that trail in the 1984 trip. So it was about 10 years later. Oh, it was a hot day. And we had no chainsaw, as I said. So I just remember chopping these fire-killed logs to try and get the pack string through. It took hours and hours to do this. It was a huge task. And I remember at one point we had run out of water. We didn't have any water with us at all. We drank whatever we had. And I remember chopping away on this big log and then hearing a little trickle off to my left in a little kind of a swale. And I clambered over the logs and through the raspberry bushes and the grass. And I remember the flies, the bees were buzzing around. And it was so hot and warm and beautiful. And then there was that little 6-inch stream of cold, clear water. And I remember burying my face in that and taking so many drinks of beautiful, beautiful water. And I just remember thinking, oh, water is life. There's no doubt about it. Water is life. And that restored us. And we were able to keep on going and eventually make the Bedeau Trail and head on up the Muskwa where we were intending to go. But that memory of that drink has always stayed with me for, what has it been now? Almost 30 years.
Your expeditions take place in the Canadian Rockies. For people who are unfamiliar with that area, how would you describe that area?
The Canadian Rockies are, the landscape is very similar to Yellowstone. If anybody knows that, or any of the mountain parks, Banff and Jasper and so on in Canada. But this is the northern extension. So it's north of the Peace, but it's the same mountains. The only difference is that, the tide of industrial development, or you could call it colonization, swept across the continent. And this part was the last piece that has not been totally accessed and developed. Essentially, what we have is a big chunk of the continental wilderness that once existed. It's about 15 million acres or 6.5 million hectares, which is, for those who care, it's about the size of Ireland, roughly, or Switzerland, sort of in that range. It's huge. It's 6.5% of the province of BC. And so when you get into that country, I mean, it is huge wilderness. There's no question about that. But the landscape and the mountains are the same all the way up and down the Rocky Mountains. They're very similar.
When you see pictures of that area, you see these high, jagged, rocky peaks, just miles and miles and miles of forest, and then vast valleys. It's kind of almost hard to comprehend how big, wide, and untamed that area is.
Well, there's nothing like it in the States. You can't find anything like that, even close. The Kachika is 2.2 million hectares, which is, what is that? It's about 7 million acres of pure wilderness. There's the odd little road that an outfitter has made a trail down to the river for jet boat access and that kind of thing to their camps. But other than that, the valley the whole entire watershed is pristine. And that is a resource of, truly international importance. It's staggeringly important that we have these places that are still intact and still whole and still vibrant on a scale that is just mind-blowing. I mean, when we go in, we can travel for 3 months at a time and never cross a road or see a power line or pipeline, anything like that. No industrial infrastructure. And so, yeah, it's pretty amazing country to be in and to experience.
On the wall behind you, you have a number of what look to be First Peoples artifacts. Do you have much contact with them? And if so, what on these travels?
Yeah, the First Nations have used this land for millennia, literally. And so we see their signs and, the evidence that they've been there before. One of the things we see quite often is hearths. So there'll be an arrangement of rocks. Maybe there'll be 3 rocks together. They like to put 2 and then 1 behind it. Maybe, like the size of a loaf of bread or a little bigger. And then they build a small fire in there and that third rock reflects the heat. That we find those. We find flakes from tool making. I remember coming up the Bessa River and following a cat trail that had been put in, and there was a small creek. And on the other side of that creek, there was a bank, but no trees now because the cat had pushed it off. But there on the ground, in the clay, was a scattering of rocks. And it was kind of in a semicircle, maybe a couple feet wide or so. What is that? That's really odd because there were no other rocks around in this spot. It was all just a clay bank. And I bent down and had a look, and I picked one of those little pieces up. Sure enough, it's a flake. Somebody has created a tool there in the past, flaked away all these pieces, and there they were, still laid out in what would be a classic example of lithic scatter. And I felt a real connection with the person who had done that, because there was the evidence that they were still, there making the evidence was still there that they were making a tool on that very spot. Sometimes we do find the artifacts themselves. And this is a hand axe that came from a trail in the Muskwa-Kachika. This axe was laying there for a long, long time because this side is nice and clean. That's probably the upper side of the axe. And this side is got a more of a patina and it looks a bit dirtier, but that's the chemical change from laying protected for so many years. How long? Nobody knows. It could be centuries, possibly even millennia, although this was right in the middle of a horse trail. So I think probably hundreds of years is more likely. Beautiful thing. This is made of black chert, which is a local stone in the Muskwa-Kachika. Beautiful thing.
Seeing evidence of their presence Are there still folks out there living?
There are folks living in the country for sure. There's a couple of native communities around the outside of the Muskwa-Kachika, Quadacha, Fort Liard, the Fort Ware folks, but all around the Muskwa-Kachika, First Nations access that country for hunting and just carrying out the traditional pursuits. So that continuity has not been broken. It's still there. Also, a lot of them are involved in the guide outfitting industry and acting as guides and wranglers and that kind of thing. But more importantly, they live in the country and are still part of it, as they always have been. And certainly around Moose Lake, which is just south of Muncho Lake on the Alaska Highway, is First Nations community that are still active in the Muskwa-Kachika and still living there as they always have for, well, who knows how long. Certainly for thousands of years.
I'd like to take you to your expedition, Prophet River. Why the Prophet River?
Why the Prophet River? Wow. It's because of my dad. My dad would tell me about the Prophet River all the time. He said, "Oh, that country up there." He said, that's where all the First Nations guides go at that time. We were living near Chetwynd and Moberly Lake. There's a big reserve, a couple of big reserves just north of Chetwynd at Moberly Lake. And all the folks that we knew at that time, because my dad was a contractor and clearing for hydro dams, clearing for power lines and that kind of thing, we a lot of the guys that came to work for my dad were the First Nations folks from Moberly and the surrounding reserves. They went up to the Muskwa-Kachika all the time, the Prophet River, where the giant moose and giant grizzlies and the caribou were so thick they'd come in and bother the horses, that kind of thing. So my dad always told me about the Prophet River, and so I just decided, well, why not just go? And after our trip into the Spatsizi, which was fantastic, the landscape's amazing over there. Next time, let's try the Prophet. And so that's what we did. We packed up. We had 6 head of horses, my girlfriend and I, little dog, Rio, and away we went. It was an undertaking.
Take us through that trip. As you set out, what were your expectations?
We knew that we were planning to spend 3 months out there and do a long, long trip. So it was a bit daunting. And as we came over the hill at Pink Mountain, travel through the community of Pink Mountain, you come down the hill on the other side, and there laid out before you on a big swath of country to the west is the line of peaks in the Muskwa-Kachika, or the Prophet River country. And I remember the feeling that, oh my gosh, we're going to go into those mountains and we're not coming out for 3 months. We're going to be spending our time in there. What are we going to encounter? Are we going to be able to survive? How are we going to be able to cross those rivers and find those passes? Because at that time, there was no maps of a good part of that country. There was no 1 to 50,000s, for instance. And of course, GPS and all of that kind of stuff was unheard of. We had no communication, no way to communicate, no radio or anything else. Yeah, I remember my mom was pretty worried because here we were heading off and she wouldn't hear from us for, weeks and weeks, if not months. So yeah, it was a daunting prospect, but also very exciting. I mean, here we are, we're going into this amazing country, and we're independent. We have our 6 horses. We can travel wherever we want and whenever we want. It was an amazing experience, no question about that.
Let's do a typical day on that expedition.
Expedition life follows a rhythm. First thing, you have to find out where the horses are. That is the first thing. So you get up in the morning, listen for those bells. Can you hear the bells? If you can't, then you go out and look for them. Find them where they are. Could be, who knows? It could be anywhere from 50 yards to 5,000. And away you go, looking for those horses. Get them back into camp, and then saddle up, get ready to pack up. Of course, you finished all your breakfast, pack up all the gear, take down the tents, tarp if you have it up, and pack up, and then head out into the mountains. The hard part, of course, is that, there were no maps of the trails in that country. So we basically had to route find the entire way. And that was, I shouldn't say there was no maps. There was a map of the Bedeau expedition. And the Bedeau expedition had mapped out where they went. So we did have that. And we had other reports, like, for instance, one of the guide outfitters told us, yeah, we have a cabin on the upper Muskwa and we come from the Tushoti. So we knew that there was a trail between there somewhere. And that was what we were going on, is that, basically hearsay that there was a trail somewhere. And that was what we had to go on. But that was, that breeds independence and self-reliance. And that was a good lesson for me.
Now, did you have a general compass direction that you were following?
No, not exactly. We had goals that we wanted to get to. Like, we wanted to get to certainly the Upper Prophet. And then we wanted to get to Fern Lake on the head of the Muskwa, which is it's the Rocky Mountain Divide. So we knew we wanted to go to those places. And then over the top into the Chesterfield and Hayworth country, which we did. A rough country over there. That it's on the western side of the Rockies, and it gets a lot more rain, a lot more windfall. The trees are bigger. Even Devil's Club can come into that country. So that it's getting pretty wet and pretty challenging over there. But it was interesting country to visit. And then we came back and we wanted to get to the Gatho up on the, getting close to the Tushoti. And that's as far as we managed to make it, onto the headwaters of the Tushoti River. And then we retraced our steps and headed back for the highway down the Prophet.
As you're traveling along, tell us about the wildlife you see.
The Muskwa-Kachika, it's the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So it's a rain shadow. So the rain is not as heavy on the eastern slopes. As a result, there's a lot of grasslands. And so the populations of elk and moose, caribou, stone sheep, mountain goat are very, very, relatively high, higher than, just about anywhere in the Rockies. And so we're living with the animals. We see them all the time. You can be woken up in the middle of the night by the thump, thump, thump of a moose trotting by, for instance. You can see a grizzly bear at any point. They can come around at night or during the day. You can surprise them on the trail. But although this happened many times, we've never had an instance where a bear has caused us any grief whatsoever. A couple of times they've charged, but this is like they're just kind of curious, basically, and their response is to charge closer and see what's going on. And so, if you don't panic at that point and start shooting, for instance, usually those situations are all resolved. And as I say, we've never had an issue. A bear has never even come into camp and wrecked our grub boxes or whatever. And we keep all our food in the panniers. But the difference is we're not hunting out there. And so we don't have meat in camp, and we don't, we keep a very clean camp. We burn all of our garbage as soon as it's, as soon as we're done with it, for instance, and pack out everything that's left. And that process really helps out with the bears. We've never had a problem with the bears, I've said.
In Montana, I had an encounter with a moose during an adventure race, and I had never seen a moose before, up close or far away. And you don't realize how huge those animals are.
Very intimidating when they're close.
And dangerous too. And of course, I was naive. I didn't know much about them. We're coming up through this little slot pass. There wasn't much room. There was just a trail at the top of this mountain pass. And I'm walking up and going, "Oh, look at the moose." One of my teammates grabs my pack, pulls me back, and then schools me on moose. And so we had to scramble up around to avoid the moose. But yeah, they are big, big animals.
Yeah, and generally they're not a problem, but they're not aggressive unless they've got a young calf that they want to protect. And I wouldn't get around a rutting bull either. But the thing is that they're not all the same. They have different characters. Out at our main base camp, there's quite a few moose around there, and we watch them, along the shores of the lake from the camp. And we get to know these moose. And there's one moose, we called her the old bag. And that old moose, for some reason, she was just cantankerous as hell. And if another moose came around, even though it had a calf, she would just charge that thing up on her hind legs and charge the other moose. She was just a bag. And while the other ones wouldn't do that, they were calmer and basically friendlier. So yeah, it just depends which moose you meet, Michael. That's the thing.
You never know.
You never know.
On that Prophet River expedition, there was one point in time where it got pretty sketchy. Where was that at?
Well, we'd been on the trail for over 2 months. And on the way up in the summer, and the early part of the summer, we'd encountered a guide outfitter who on the trail that gave us some trail advice on where to go, how to get back. He said, "You've come up the hardest way. You've come up the Muskwa River, and that's really pretty challenging. But we come a different way, and we go by way of the head of the Prophet," he said. But meanwhile, our pack strings were passing on the trail, and there was no time. And I wanted to get a map that he could at least show me where this route was, but that wasn't possible just because of the way the horses were acting up. And so we had to separate. We had to get the strings apart, and that was the end of the conversation. Well, then we had to decide how we were going to get back. Well, here's this outfitter has told us about the head of the Prophet. Let's go that way. So we decided to find that route, and we chose what we thought was the most reasonable route through the mountains. But it turned out that it was there was actually no route there. We ended up going up a rock face. There was this very small track that we could get up along the side of this rock face and just get the horses up through there. But by the time they got up, a couple had slipped, their legs were all bleeding, and it was a rough spot. And I knew we can't get the horses back down here. So we were committed. We were on our way up to what we thought was the pass. But again, there was no maps. Like we had, I think at that point, it was a 1 to 250,000 map that we had, which is so general that it, you can hide a 200-foot cliff in that map and it wouldn't even show. So yeah, we ended up camping that night it was well into the Alpine. There was a huge glacier on the mountain behind us, and all night long that glacier kept calving off, and you could hear these boom, boom as the ice came off the glacier, and it started to snow. And this was in the early part of September, about 10th of September or something like that. And down comes the snow, and it starts to build up. And we know we've got to get over this pass, and we have not found a shred of a trail. So at that point, before we'd even started to tackle the pass, things were looking dicey potentially for we could always walk out, but our pack string, there was a chance that we could lose all of the animals there for sure. It was a challenging situation.
Now, get up into this pass. How many days did it take you to actually cross through?
We started off the first day on the pass. We left from the Big Bar on the Muskwa, heading south towards the Quadacha. And then we turned up a side valley to head over to the head of the Prophet. So the next day, as I said, it had started to snow, and we decided, no, we're going to wait. We're going to wait a day. Even though we were running out of stove fuel, we had about 2 cups of stove fuel left, very little food at that point. And there was absolutely no firewood. We were camped behind a huge boulder about the size of a bus. That was the only shelter we had. And the snow kept coming down. And it got deeper and deeper. And the next morning, it was still cloudy and still snowing. But there was no choice. We just had to go. We agreed we have to leave. So we packed up the horses and headed out over the pass, or what we thought was the pass. But the snow kept coming, and it got up past knee deep. As we were approaching what we thought was the final stretch for the pass, we came to an area. Basically, it was a river of boulders that was flowing down the mountainside under its own weight and the combined forces of gravity and frost, frost action and so on. So it was like a slow motion river of boulders. I knew at that point that it was very, very bad. And I told Caroline, I stopped the string and I said, this is really bad. I walked back to her and we had a talk. I said, this is really bad. This is leg breaking stuff. And she said, well, do we have any choice? I said, no, I don't think we do. We can't go down to the Quadachaw. That's too rough and take too long. We can't go back. We have to go ahead. Okay, that was the decision. On we went. Inevitably, I heard Carol-Ann yell, Wayne. And I looked back and I saw our pack horse Flash. Flash was a favorite guy. He was young and friendly and strong young horse, beautiful horse. We loved that horse. Bright blue eyes, striking guy. And I heard a crack. And I went back, I looked back, and there he was hanging over a boulder. His foot had gotten stuck in a hole. He had over-levered and basically broken his back leg. Of course, at that point, there's no hope that you're going to be able to get him out of there. So there was nothing else to do but head back to my saddle horse and get the rifle. So at that point, that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, is to take that action. And it was ironic that, he had been shod. The good horse had been shod months before, miles and miles of rough travel. And when I shot, he had levered over the boulder, fell down into the hole on the other side. And as a final kind of an incongruous touch, one of his shoes popped off and tinkled on the rocks. I could hear that metal going tinkle, tinkle, tinkle as it fell down the rocks. And I thought, that is so strange. And then our beautiful horse lying there in a tangle of bloody ropes and packs and so on. So we had no choice but to, because survival depended on it, you have to put your feelings aside and focus on the task that has to be done. And in this case, that was unpack that horse, take what we wanted from the saddle. We left the saddle there, and we had no way to pack it. Pack everything on my saddle horse, his packs, and say goodbye and head on up the mountain towards what we thought was the pass. So at that point, it got steeper and steeper and steeper. We ended up going up a snowfield that we thought was potentially the trail, but of course it was all covered with snow. But there, coming in from the right, was a set of caribou tracks. And it looked like a trail of a few of these animals had come through. And there they were, going up the way we thought the trail should go. And so we followed that trail up through the snow until we got right to the crest of the divide. It was about 7,500 feet. And at that point, we were looking to find a way down. And as I came to what I thought would be the trail down to the Prophet River, I could feel the wind behind me blowing the snowflakes out over my shoulders. And as I come to what I thought was the edge of the trail, it dropped away in a sheer set of cliffs, hundreds and hundreds of feet down. There was no way that we could get the horses down there. And the wind was blowing those snowflakes out over my shoulders into a white void because it was so cloudy. Oh, well, misty and snowy and so on. The phrase just popped into my head, no way forward. No way forward. What do you do? Well, the only thing we could do was follow the caribou. They had turned, instead of going what we thought was the pass, they had turned and gone up the shoulder of the mountain to the right, steeply up through the rocks. Well, we followed them. We took the pack string and away we went up through the rocks. Well, at the top, they had arced over and dropped down into a little plateau, and I managed to spot those caribou. There was 5 big bulls with their antlers moving in the mist, and 1 small bull. I thought, those guys, they're saving us because we were following their trail. So I immediately pulled back. I didn't want to scare them because I didn't want them to, leave their preferred trail. So I pulled back and we waited a while until they had left. And then we came down to that spot, and there was a small lake with about 2 feet of slush in the water. But at least we didn't have to boil snow to make water. We could drink the water directly out of the little lake and not waste our precious stove fuel. And so we camped there that night in about, snow over knee deep. We were very careful to sweep everything, all the snow away that we could, put down tarps, put all our gear on those tarps and cover it up so that it wasn't lost, because in that kind of snow, you could lose gear easy. The next morning, we woke up and the snow fortunately had stopped. And there were the line of tracks that the caribou had left, heading off toward the Prophet River where we wanted to go. And then suddenly they turned and down this steep ravine they went. But there was a trail there that we could follow along the edge of the ravine. And as we were traveling down the mountain, I hit this, basically it was like a river of wet cement that was stationary, wasn't flowing, but all the snow had fallen off the cliffs that we had tried to get around the night before and was avalanching and flowing down the slope in a river. If we would have been hit by that, I mean, our whole packstring would have been carried down the hill, and there was more cliffs below that it would have been pretty close to fatal, if not so. But ultimately, the caribou led us through, and we managed to follow them all the way down to the bottom. And there, the blessed head of the Prophet River, there was a little trickle of water that was about this wide. That was the very beginning of the Prophet River. And so, wow, the caribou had saved us, saved our lives, saved the lives of our pack string as well, because there's no way we could have got them through any other way.
I mean, I could see from your expression as we're talking, the loss of Flash. I have to imagine being out there weeks and weeks with your horses. You bond with them. They're like your family. That has to be quite a loss.
Oh, and to take action to end the life is it's totally wrenching. I mean, it takes a chunk out of you, a big one, and I know I feel it to this day.
Describe for me the person who started on that trip and the person who came out of that wilderness. How did you change?
I went in an exploiter and came out a conservationist. I think that was if I could put it into that short of a sentence, I think that's how it went. I at the beginning, I was interested in what we could discover. I was going to go hunting and fishing. Oh, I love to fish. Let's catch some more of those nice big bull trouts and whatever else. It was all about what I could take from the wilderness. Could be also, pictures or stories or whatever, what I could take. And then as I lived in the wilderness for month after month, and I got to understand how things go out there and how important it is and how interconnected everything is and what an amazing, vibrant whole it is. Then I began to understand that those actions that we used to take, like, logging, we go into a valley, pristine, put in a road and just log the thing out. Well, at that point I thought, this is just the natural way of things. It's what we do as humans and normal, natural, the forest will recover and blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, that's all true, except that there's interim issues that arise. Like, for instance, where are the caribou going to live in the meantime when you've taken all their habitat away? What about the wolverines? And on and on and on. And so I realized that my association with the wilderness and that Prophet trip was instrumental in that those healthy ecosystems, those in the wilderness, are so important and so fragile at the same time. And I guess it took months to understand that. And also the fact that we'd been saved by the caribou. It was profound. And I felt that I owe a debt to the wilderness and that had essentially, both nurtured and also saved us. That debt meant that, it didn't happen for a while. It was about, half a dozen years or more until I started to actually work for the conservation of the Muskoka-Chika. They were going to punch some roads right into the head of, I think that was the Prophet River and also the Sikanee River at that point. And I realized what this was going to do to the country because we'd seen it around Chetwynd, valley after valley that we had, personally eroded and essentially destroyed from a an ecological perspective. And I realized this was going to happen up in the Muskwa-Kachika too. It was coming, and it's coming like a freight train. And somebody had to stand up and do something about it. And I thought, well, I guess I might as well, because, I feel it. And so that's what I did. I just stood up and started speaking for the protection of the place. And many, many years later, here we are.
Those many, many years, I understand, was a lot of good work by you and a lot of folk, the community, to protect that area. Can you tell us about that? What it took to protect that area?
It started out, the protection of the MK, it started out for us working with the Chetwynd Environmental Society. We founded the society and then used it as a mechanism to basically bring our concerns to government and to make it public as well. And the fact that the roads were going into so many valleys was a real goad to us, a real push. We had to do something about that. And at least, if we couldn't stop it, at least we could get it to a point where it was acceptable. And so that was what I thought going in to the conservation movement, if you want, for the MK. And at that point, the government was starting a new process. It was called the Land and Resource Management Planning Process. Because we were, kind of the loudest group, they contacted us and asked if we wanted to participate. Better to have your enemies close, and then you can work with these guys. And so, absolutely, let's get involved with planning. And so that started in late 1992, and these are multi-sector planning processes that including all the people with interests in the Muskwa-Kachika, and the surrounding land base as well. It wasn't only in the MK; it was all that land to the east, which is basically the industrial heartland for certainly for oil and gas, and lots of forestry and some mining as well. So all these folks had to be at the table. First Nations they had mixed participation, because from a political perspective, the government had said you have to check your rights at the door, essentially, so that we can do this planning. First Nations didn't want to do that. They're not stakeholders. They have an interest in the land base that has been guaranteed by the courts, or affirmed by the courts, I should say. So they're a different level. And as a result, many First Nations did not want to participate in the planning process, but some did. And I think that those ones who did participate, I think they got two kicks at the can. First of all, they got to address many of their issues through the land and resource management planning process. But then also after that, they got to, again, negotiate with government on specific points that had not been covered or were missed or were inadequately addressed during that process. So I think those First Nations who participated, I think they actually got two kicks at the can. It was an important one. But for the rest of us, all of us who were there at the table, we desperately wanted to get these things done. It took from 1992 to 1998 of, pretty concentrated negotiations, 6 years, locked in cooperation, as we want to say. We had no choice. If we didn't come to an agreement, government was going to come to an agreement. They were going to make their own decision if we didn't come to an agreement. So this was a powerful incentive for us to get our act together. Because if we didn't do it, government was going to step in, and that could go anywhere. Nobody wanted that because it's unpredictable. So essentially, we started to negotiate. Going in, I thought my way was the right way. I had the vision. I had an idea on what should happen, and it was absolutely 100% correct. I found out just how wrong I was. The collected wisdom of the group is so much more than any one individual. Solutions would arise just spontaneously from around the table to vexing problems that we had encountered. And so I began to, although I may disagree with the other people at the table on the specifics, I understood where they were coming from. It took years, and a respect started to grow. I respected these people because they were there for reasons that I could identify with. They wanted to make sure that their families were healthy, that they had decent jobs. They wanted to also protect the environment. Nobody wanted to wreck the environment. And so it was just a matter of finding out how we could accommodate all these interests. It was a consensus-based process, so essentially we all had to agree at the end. Now, agreement could take the form with, okay, I'm going to let this go forward. I don't agree with all of it, but it's okay to go forward. I won't oppose it. It could be like that. Or it could be 100% agreement. Yeah, we all love this idea. Or, alternatively, no, none of us like this idea. Or somebody doesn't like this enough that they can't accept it. Therefore, we have to go somewhere else and find another plan. So I guess the upshot is that consensus process was extremely powerful. And those agreements that we came to at that point are still standing, still in place, and still strong. And the reason is because, it was vetted through 6 years of intense negotiations, and very, very powerful process.
What's the status of the Musqueam-Kachika now?
The Musqueam-Kachika right now is it has its own legislative designation. So there's an act, the Musqueam-Kachika Management Area Act, and that specifies that wilderness and wildlife must be maintained over time. Now, Musqueam-Kachika is not a park. Through the process, we agreed that about a third of it would be put into parks, roughly, and that's off limits to industrial development. But the other 2/3 would be open for industrial development with the proviso that wilderness and wildlife had to be maintained in the long run. Now, how do you do that? How do you put in an oil and gas well and maintain wilderness in the long run? Well, you make your roads temporary. You put your infrastructure in a way that can be pulled out after. And this has been done. There's a case it's called Chicken Creek project, Murphy Oil. And they built a snow road. They actually had snow guns, like you'd use for ski hills and that kind of thing, and created snow, built the snow base for this road. It was about, I think in total about probably 10 kilometers, maybe a little less than that, 6 kilometers up into the mountains. And, from our perspective as conservationists, we're overjoyed that these wells were unproductive. They were duster. They drilled 2 wells up there. But after that, they took all those roads out, and even the pad that the well was on, they had hauled that material in, put it down on geotextile mats, and removed that at the end of the development cycle. The valley, if you went in there now, you'd be hard pressed to identify where those well sites were or that they had even existed. It's been about 15 years now, maybe a little more since they went in. Remarkable.
That balance could be found.
Yeah. With the proviso, it's the only example. There's a real inertia in the business to keep doing it the way we've always done it, because we know what we're doing. It's the cheapest way or least expensive, and we understand it. So to go to something new, like for instance, heliportable drilling, to fly these rigs in and out, that kind of thing, is a real huge challenge. Mind you, they can do it when they're pushed and when they have to. So the Musqueam-Kachika is so valuable and so important that, everybody has to understand that it's got to be done differently here if you're going to do it at all. That is the challenge of the MK.
You have to feel a sense of pride and satisfaction of being such a critical part of that development.
Yeah, and I would say there was a lot of us involved. It took a whole bunch of people to make this happen. The big conservation groups kicked in, naturalists, fish and wildlife groups, BC Wildlife Fed, conservation of all stripes, hunting, non-hunting. Everyone had a role to play to push this thing forward. And so, I kind of view myself as, because I was the negotiator at the table, I was kind of the pointy bit of the spear, but it took everyone to make this thing happen. It would not have happened. Oh, and I should, before I forget, First Nations, while they weren't officially directly involved, they certainly put their shoulder to the wheel and supported the project. And in that way, it went forward. Also, wildlife groups and so on. Let's not forget government, because government had to agree. And you're taking a big chunk of ground and you're changing the entire way that it's operated, and some of it you're setting aside. This is a real big challenge, and there's a lot of different attitudes out there. The mayor of Fort Nelson came to the table at one point, and we were talking about the Muskwekachika because it was on the horizon, and people were scared of this thing taking away this land base. And the mayor of Fort Nelson said, "Listen, my idea is if it's going to be a protected area, it's going to be 1 mile by 1 mile, and you can drive to it." Oh, well, I had to respond to that. And I said, there's a lot of opinions on how wildlife should be treated and wilderness should be treated. But for sure, one of the things that we do agree is that it should be bigger than 1 mile by 1 mile. And so we agree to disagree on this point. That's where we left that. And fortunately, our vision and the vision of the table prevailed at the end of the day, and the Muskwekachika was put in place.
And what do you have coming up in the future?
Oh, well, we're embarked on a really interesting project right now. The Muskwekachika is essentially largely unknown certainly in the academic community. There's been some work up there in research and so on, but there's a real need for more research because the Muskwekachika is still pristine. It acts as a control. It can act as a control. Certainly, our Mayfield site. It's a valley that's 80 miles long or whatever. It has no roads, no development of any kind, no ATVs. There's a few jet boat access or some jet boat access down in the lower part of the river. But the upper part, the 30 or 40 miles, has no human access basically at all other than air and whatever horse travel, which is extremely infrequent. So it can act as a control. And we're looking at developing a research station idea that could potentially help to collect research for the Muskwekachika. And as part of that, we're putting in some infrastructure, basically a pavilion roof and other infrastructure at our Mayfield camp to accommodate research, because we just think that over the long run, it's going to be so important that people understand what the values of the place are and how, I guess, to shine a light on our activities in other areas, I think is so important. If you compare what wildlife are doing in a pristine area compared to what they're doing in a impacted area, I think that will draw out a lot of information and really, really important ideas. So we're working to put that in place at this point. We have a lot of interest and we're well on our way on that project.
You've written a book, Crossing the Great Divide. How'd that come about?
I have to give credit to my wife, Donna, for this. She knew that I had some stories written because when I'm on the trap line, there's always time in the evenings to do some writing and that kind of thing. And I had a collection of stories that I'd written, but she insisted, "Wayne, you've got to get those things out. You've got to put them out and see if you can get it published." So Creekstone Press is a press here in British Columbia that was looking for a new project, and Donna had those contacts. They took a look at the manuscript that I had prepared, and they agreed, "Yeah, let's do this thing."
If folks want to get a copy of that book, where can they get it?
It's called Crossing the Divide, and it's available on. It's not available on Amazon, but it's available from all independent booksellers, certainly in British Columbia. So Monroe's Books is a good one. Chapters can get it. Any independent bookseller will have that. Will have access to that book.
Any thoughts about lessons learned over the years of your wilderness travel?
Well, there's a lot of lessons out there that certainly that you learn. One of the things I tell my guides, well, there's a few different ones, but certainly be calm at all times is the one that I tell them. What things go to hell, a horse starts bucking through camp, or you got a snowstorm with 2 feet of snow and you got to make it over the path. Be calm at all times. This is the first thing, and that's a personal lesson. On a larger level, I think that the Muskwekachika can teach us what true wilderness is all about. It's a place that still has all its wildlife, still pristine, still it's a big chunk of the continental wilderness that still exists in its pristine state. And that, for me, that understanding that, hey, this wasn't just more land, this was important country, and it had an important. It was important for the globe. It was internationally important, and I think that understanding was a huge lesson for me. That, yeah, we enjoy it, but it's way bigger than that. It's important for the health of the global community and the global environment. It's going to be very important in terms of climate change in the future, because as climate changes, the wildlife has to be able to adapt. And one of the easiest places to do that is in the mountains, where you have vertical relief, so that if the gets very hot, they can always move up the mountains to survive. And that's what the Muskoka Chica offers. Basically, climate ramps, they call it, where animals can survive in a varied and complex landscape that offers options for them to survive. And if it's not messed up, if you don't have roads all over the place and that kind of thing, then the chances of survival are so much more increased. So I would say the MK is important on a global level for as far as climate change goes, which is obviously a huge issue for all of us.
It seems to me that when we go into true wilderness like that, it's not so much that it changes us. It occurred to me that perhaps maybe it just brings us back to the way we naturally are, instead of being wrapped up in what we've constructed in our society. So I think it brings us back to what we truly are. And I think it's just kind of discovering or revealing ourselves, how we truly are, as opposed to changing us.
That's a good point. It gets us back to the fundamentals on what's really important.
Keeping calm in adversity.
Yeah.
Appreciating nature, and a few caribou to lead us out of danger.
Indeed. Absolutely right. There's lots of lessons there, and lots of lessons for the world, I think, in looking at, that's why I wrote the book, because I think that, the stories there, that they tell a story, but there's also a bigger thing going on. And that is, what relevance does this have to the world as a whole, and to my place in it? Not personally my place in it, but the reader's place in it. And I think that's so important, that, we consider wilderness in a way that, not many of us have in the past. I think we needed a new view of the importance of these places. Every place that's wild is important now, because of, we've gone through this world, and just in our lifetimes, it's changed so much. And so these little scraps of wilderness that are left, the Muskoka Chica is a big scrap, but there's a lot of scraps out there. All of these places are important, and all of them have to be protected if we're going to maintain, populations and ecosystems into the future. So yeah, that's what the wilderness teaches you.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us. This has been a real pleasure.
I appreciate it. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to get the word out about, certainly my favorite place on the planet, and I hope many others at this point as well, the Muskoka Chica.
Well, keep up the good work.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. We'll see you down the road.
Perfect.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhart.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.